am Kate Irish Uno, your teacher in Literary Criticism and English American Literature. So, how's your day going? Okay. Alright. By the way, monitor, have you checked the attendance? Oh, great job, class! No one's absent in our class today. Keep that up. Okay, now, are you ready to listen and learn? Okay, but first, I have here a mini game, and this will be quick and easy. We will be playing the famous 4 pics, 1 word. Okay, I'll show you the first picture. Okay, number 2. And the third picture? Okay, did you guess the words correctly? Okay, so for the first word, we have here Romanticism. Very good. Second, Gothic. Dark. Okay, very good. And lastly, very good, literature. Okay, so what do you think are these words' relation to our topic for today? Okay. Alright. Our topic for today is about an exploration of Romanticism through poetry. Are you guys ready to explore? But before that, of course, let me read to you our objectives. At the end of the discussion, the students will be able to first, define Romanticism. Second, explain the characteristics of Romanticism in poetry and literature. Third, list key writers and works of Romanticism. Lastly, analyze Poe's work and identify the poetic devices he used. Okay, let's proceed. What is Romanticism? Is this word even familiar to you? Very good. Okay, Romanticism is a literary movement that began in the late 18th century, ending around the middle of the 19th century, although its influence continues to this day. Marked by a focus on the individual and the unique perspective of a person, often guided by irrational, emotional impulses, a respect for nature and the primitive, and the celebration of the common man, Romanticism can be seen as a reaction to the huge changes in society that occurred during this period, including the revolutions that burned through countries like France and the United States, ushering in grand experiments in democracy. The term Romanticism does not stem directly from the concept of love, but rather from the French word romant, or a romantic story told in verse. So Romanticism focused on emotions and in the inner life of the writer, and often used autobiographical material to inform the work or even provide a template for it, unlike traditional literature at the time. Romanticism celebrated the primitive and elevated regular people as being deserving of celebration, which was an innovation at the time. Romanticism also fixated on nature as a primordial force and encouraged the concept of isolation as necessary for spiritual and artistic development. Romantic literature is marked by 6 primary characteristics, and these are: first, celebration of nature; second, focus on the individual and spirituality; next, celebration of isolation and melancholy; also, interest in the common man; then, idealization of women; and lastly, personification and pathetic fallacy. Okay, moving on. Does any one of you here know him? An author? A writer? Okay, so some of you has an idea already. So the man right here is Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was an American writer, editor, and literary critic. He is best known for his poetry and short stories, particularly his tales of mystery and suspense. So he is generally considered the inventor of detective fiction. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19, 1809, the last of three siblings. Both his parents died within 3 years after his birth. After he was adopted by a wealthy tobacco merchant, Poe was trained to become a businessman, but his interest was in poetry. Poe went to the University of Virginia, but he soon became overloaded with debt because his father didn't provide him with any money. When he went back to his house in Richmond, Virginia, he found that his fiancée was engaged to another man. Enraged, Poe set out to become a great poet. A few years later, Poe's mother was dying and wanted to see him. But unfortunately, when Poe made it back to Virginia, his mother was already buried. Poe enrolled in West Point. After a few months, he was kicked out. Later, when his father died, Poe was left out of the will. Before, Poe had already moved to Baltimore and wrote for a magazine. He also married a girl named Virginia Cham. Well, Virginia's mother, Maria Cham, was like another mother to Poe. But Poe was extremely dissatisfied with his impoverished life. So, at this time, his wife contracted tuberculosis. Poe moved his family to New York. In New York, he published his poem, The Raven, looking not only for commercial success but also possibly as a remembrance to all the loved ones he lost. Later that winter, his wife died. Poe died 2 years later, October 7, 1849. He is now one of the most widely read American writers of the 19th century. His appeal extends from young readers who enjoy being terrified by the macabre tales of mystery and imagination, such as The Telltale Heart, to literary critics who appreciate his pioneering analysis in the philosophy of composition of how poetry creates its effect on the reader. Poe's poems, notably The Raven and The Bells, are among the most memorable in the English language, and his stories, among them The Pit and the Pendulum and The Mask of the Red Death, still terrify readers. Poe lives on not only in American culture, but European as well, in drama, film and television, and music. The work that catapulted Poe onto the New York literary scene in January 1845 was The Raven, a poem that was immediately copied, parodied, and anthologized. The Raven is a very good representation of the literary period, Romanticism. This poem is categorized in the subcategory of dark or Gothic Romanticism. One notable characteristic of dark Romanticism is the shadowy approach to the text. In The Raven, the narrator starts off by describing the weary mood he is in reading long forgotten books. This sets up the shadowy beginning of the poem. Another characteristic of dark Romanticism is that there are many creepy symbols. In The Raven, the creepiest symbol is the raven itself. Also, characters in dark romantic novels often experience the effects of guilt and sin. The narrator in the poem ultimately drove himself mad with his own thoughts. That is why The Raven is categorized as a dark romantic poem. Even if you are familiar with The Hunting Blackbird and His Taunting Nevermore, you may not know the poem itself. The poem begins after midnight on a cold December evening. A man, the narrator, sits alone by the fire dozing off as he reads a book, hoping to forget about Lenore, his lost love. So, I have here one of his pieces, the famous The Raven. And this poem is very, very long. That's why I sent you a copy of this poem through Google Drive. So go browse and read silently. Okay, are you done reading? Very good. So The Raven is one of Edgar Allan Poe's most famous works. It was published in 1845 and instantly became an overnight success. So the poem takes place just after midnight on a December evening. A depressed man is sitting in his library, drifting in and out of sleep as he reminisces about his beloved Lenore, his lost love. The poem begins with one of the most iconic lines in the literature. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. It is a dreary midnight in December. The poem starts in the bedroom of the narrator. The narrator is reading a really old book and he is feeling very weak and weary. He is starting to fall asleep, but a sudden tapping sound wakes him up. The character was just mourning a woman named Lenore. The narrator starts to freak out about every sound or movement in his room. But he gathers up courage and opens his door, and he finds nothing. Startled, he convinces himself it was only the wind against the window. He hears the rapping again, and this time he decides to check the window. When he opened the window, a raven, a symbol of death, flew into his room and perched on a statue right above the narrator's chamber door. So the narrator is amused by the presence of the raven and asks the raven its name. The raven answers the narrator with, "Nevermore." The narrator is very surprised that the raven could talk, but he starts to feel depressed again. The narrator feels that the word nevermore describes the raven's soul, dark and lonely. He waits for the raven to leave, thinking that the bird is no more than someone who will leave him by sunrise just like all his friends. The raven says, "Nevermore," spookier than the last time. The narrator is drawn by the bird and he becomes extremely interested into it to the point that where he pulls up a chair and sits in front of it. The narrator is imagining and guessing things about the raven. Where it came from, what it experienced. As the narrator is thinking, his mind starts thinking about Lenore again and how she will never be with him again. He is getting more enraged as he thinks about Lenore. He suddenly imagines the room filling up with perfume, and he imagines that it was from God to help him forget about Lenore. But the raven interrupts his thinking by saying, "Nevermore." The narrator gets angry at the bird, calling it evil and straight from Satan, but then he suddenly changes his attitude and asks the raven if his life will get better. The raven answers him with, "Nevermore." He asks a final question. Will he ever hold his love Lenore again? The raven, of course, answers, "Nevermore." It becomes clear throughout the poem that the man is delirious and distraught over the loss of his love. The light in the room casts the shadow of the raven across the room, and the narrator feels trapped by it. He feels that he will forever be trapped in a shadow, never able to rise into the light again. So let's proceed now to the analysis of the poem. Let's start with symbol. First, we have here the raven. This is the biggest symbol in the poem. Not only is it the title of the poem, it ultimately becomes the source of the narrator's distress. When the bird first made its appearance in the poem, it was portrayed as an amusing character. But through the progression of the poem, the presence of the raven becomes ominous, ultimately driving the narrator mad. Lenore was the second symbol. She is another big symbol in the poem. We are not fully introduced to her as a character. All we know is that she is someone that the narrator yearns for. So the narrator tries to turn his mind away from thinking about her, but he is not successful. He was driven even deeper into his personal abyss when he asked the raven whether he will see her again, and the bird answers with, "Nevermore." So next is the theme. Theme will be grief, darkness, night. And this is a very important theme in the poem. The story starts during a very dark night. When the narrator first checks outside his door for the source of the rapping, Poe describes that there is darkness. Darkness, but nothing more. Also, the narrator opens the window into dark night, letting in a dark raven, and he starts having dark thoughts and feel trapped in the raven's dark shadow. Poe was trying to use darkness to set the scene and the mood, and he also wanted to show the narrator's slow descent into his own darkness. Next, we have rhyme. This is a literary device that Poe constantly used in the poem. So the first sentence of each stanza always rhymes. From the first line, we have, "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary." We also have a phrase from the seventh line, "Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December." Third, we have from the 19th line of the poem, "Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating them no longer." And the 79th line, "Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer." Lastly, from the line number 103, "And the raven, never fleeting, still is sitting, still is sitting." So The Raven was a poem that Poe prized very much. Poe considered it as the jewel of all his works and the height of his writing. So The Raven seems to be based on more of Poe's personal thoughts and experiences than anything happening in the world outside Poe's mind. So at a very young age, Poe lost his birth parents, even though he was taken in a very wealthy family. His relationship with his foster father disintegrated. Poe ended up leaving the household. A few years later, his foster mother was dying and wanted to see him, but unfortunately, when he traveled back, when he reached his house, his mother was already buried. So later, right before Poe published The Raven, his wife Virginia contracted tuberculosis. She died shortly after The Raven was published. So through his past experiences, we can infer that The Raven was largely based on Poe's inner mind. He had faced so much death and despair that Poe had reason to feel like the narrator in The Raven. Okay, so let's proceed now to our evaluation. I have here 5 questions and you will answer this on your notebooks. So first we have, what do you think changed the representation of the raven from amusing to ominous in the narrator's eyes? Number 2, in the poem, the raven changed in the eyes of the narrator many times. What do you think the raven represents if you were in the place of the narrator? Number 3, do you believe that the narrator was driven mad by his own thoughts, or was he just extremely depressed by his own thoughts? Number 4, who do you think the character Leonard in the poem is representing in Poe's life? And number 5, Poe considered The Raven his most successful piece of writing. And what do you think about it? Okay, are you done? Okay, let's answer. Number 1. Can you please read the question number 1 and read your answer? Yes, please. Okay, thank you. For me, it was the narrator's process of communicating with the raven that changed his view of the raven. In the beginning, the narrator found the raven as amusing, but he started talking to the raven about things that he was really depressed about. The only thing that the raven said was, "Nevermore." The narrator asked the raven whether he will see Leonard again, and the raven answered with, of course, "Nevermore." That ultimately changed the presence of the raven, ominous in the narrator's eyes. Okay, number 2, please read Micah. And your answer is? Very well said. If I were in the place of the narrator, I would have been pretty scared that there is a bird in my house. Instead of talking to it, I would be trying to get it out of my house. But if I had to choose what the raven represents, of course I would say that it represents death. Ravens are scavengers and they fed on dead animals. That's why I would say it represents death. Okay, thank you. Number 3. Who would like to answer? Yes, Earl. And your answer is? Thank you. Okay. What a wonderful answer. So, The answer for this could go either way. It is evident that the narrator was indeed very depressed, but whether he really became mad is for you to decide. Some may argue that the narrator did go mad since at the end of the poem, the narrator himself even stated that he will never rise into the light again. But some may also argue that it was late at night. He was reading creepy books, there was a creepy bird, the narrator was just creeped out, so this answer could go either way. Number 4, will you please read Anne? And your answer is? Very good! So the character Leonard in The Raven could represent many people in Poe's life. Poe had 3 important women in his life. They were his mother, mother-in-law, and wife. Leonard could be referring to his mother who died many years ago, or it could be his wife who was dying of tuberculosis. Number 5, who would like to answer? Yes, friends. Okay, alright. I agree with Poe. The Raven is definitely a masterpiece in terms of poetry. This piece is very representative of Poe's style. The dark theme, creepy symbols, and disillusioned characters all showed up in this poem. Also, Poe used rhyme effectively to carry the flow of the poem along leading to the climax. The poem is also very interesting. The raven in the poem seemed like it was the one driving the narrator to madness. But at the same time, the raven seems to just be a bystander, observing the narrator in his slow descent into darkness. Okay, and that ends our lesson for today. Have you learned something? Is there any question or clarification? Okay, thank you for listening and participating. For your assignment, answer the following questions. Number 1, how do great writers create a mood that readers can feel? How is this evident in The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe? Number 2, how does Poe use language to create drama? Number 3, what are the parts of a poem and how can identifying them aid analysis? So, number 4, how do literary elements affect readers' understanding of a literary work? Number 5, how does death affect the living? Also, class, try to read and browse about another literary movement, which is modern literature, for that will be our next topic. Once again, thank you and have a great day. Goodbye, class!